There are prisons in America meant to punish. There are prisons meant to control. And then, there are prisons designed to remove people from society completely. These are the places where inmates are sent not to be rehabilitated, not to be prepared for release, but to be contained, isolated, and forgotten. Behind layers of concrete, steel doors, and silent corridors, thousands of men live out sentences that have no real end. Some will never step outside again. Others don't even know when they might. Their days are measured not in years, but in routines, counts, lockdowns, transfers, and long hours alone. What makes these prisons different isn't just the walls. It's the system behind them. A system that decides who is too dangerous to mix with others, who is too disruptive to be housed normally, and who must be placed where control matters more than humanity. Most Americans will never see these facilities. They don't appear in movies. They aren't open for tours. And officials rarely talk about what actually happens inside. But these prisons exist, and they are growing. In this documentary, we are going inside America's most restrictive prison system. We'll break down how inmates end up here, what daily life really looks like, how control is enforced, and why once someone enters this system, getting out is nearly impossible. This is not speculation. This is not fiction. This is the hidden side of American incarceration, where people are sent to be forgotten. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. To understand how someone ends up in America's most restrictive prisons, you first have to understand one thing clearly. Most inmates do not choose this path. They are selected for it. Across the United States, prison systems operate on a layered structure. At the bottom are minimum security facilities. At the top are places designed for absolute control. Moving up that ladder isn't just about the crime someone committed. It's about how the system perceives risk. Every inmate is constantly being evaluated. Disciplinary reports, behavioral assessments, gang intelligence, mental health flags, history of violence, attempts to escape. All of it feeds into a classification score. On paper, this process looks objective. In reality, it is opaque, slow to reverse, and heavily weighted toward punishment rather than rehabilitation. An inmate might be transferred after a single violent incident, another after repeated rule violations. Some are moved simply because officials believe they could be a future threat. Once that label is applied, high risk, management problem, security threat, the options narrow fast. For state prisoners, this often means being sent to a super maximum security unit or long-term segregation. For federal inmates, it can mean transfer to facilities designed specifically to limit human interaction. And here's the critical point. Many of these decisions happen without a clear end date. An inmate may be told they're being transferred temporarily. Weeks turn into months. Months turn into years. Appeals exist, but they are slow, technical, and rarely successful without legal help. For some inmates, the transfer doesn't even happen immediately. Instead, it starts with isolation. A disciplinary infraction leads to segregation. Segregation leads to reduced movement. Reduced movement leads to fewer programs. Fewer programs lead to worse evaluations. It's a cycle that feeds itself. By the time an inmate is formally moved into the highest levels of control, the system already sees them as someone who cannot be managed anywhere else. This is how prisons justify extreme conditions, not as punishment, but as necessity. Officials use phrases like institutional safety and order maintenance. They describe these facilities as the last option. But critics argue something else is happening. They say the system isn't just responding to danger. It's creating permanent outcasts, people who are locked into a status they can't escape, no matter how much time passes or behavior changes. Once an inmate enters this level of incarceration, their world shrinks dramatically. Movement becomes rare. Social contact becomes controlled. Privacy disappears, but so does visibility. From the outside, these inmates fade from public attention. From the inside, their lives become defined by rules few people ever see. And this is only the beginning. In the next chapter, we'll step inside these facilities and examine what daily life actually looks like for inmates sent to be forgotten, hour by hour, door by door, silence by silence. Once an inmate enters one of America's most restrictive prisons, daily life changes immediately and permanently. There is no adjustment period. No orientation that eases the transition. The rules are enforced from the first moment the cell door closes. Most inmates in these facilities spend 22 to 23 hours a day alone. Their cell is not just a place to sleep. It is where they eat, think, exercise, and exist. The space is small, usually made of poured concrete, designed to eliminate blind spots and limit movement. Furniture is bolted down. The bed is concrete or steel. The desk, the stool, even the sink are fixed in place. The door is solid steel, often with a narrow slot used for food trays, handcuffs, and brief communication. Some cells have windows, but they are narrow, frosted, or positioned in a way that prevents seeing outside clearly. Time inside these prisons does not move like it does on the outside. Days blur together. Morning begins with count. Afternoon brings another count. Evening ends with count again. Between those moments, silence dominates. Meals are delivered through the slot in the door. Inmates eat alone, often without utensils, under strict time limits. Food is one of the few moments that marks the passing of the day, but even that becomes routine. Exercise, when permitted, usually happens alone. Instead of a yard filled with people, inmates may be escorted, sometimes shackled, to a small, enclosed concrete area. No grass, no equipment, just walls and sky. Some describe it as a cage inside a cage. Human interaction is minimal and highly controlled. When inmates leave their cell, it's often during staggered movement schedules to prevent contact with others. Conversations are discouraged. Eye contact can be interpreted as a threat. Any deviation from routine can result in disciplinary action. Even medical visits and mental health check-ins are brief and procedural. A voice through the door. A clipboard checked. A question asked and answered in seconds. Correctional officers are trained to maintain distance. Not out of cruelty, but policy. Familiarity is viewed as a risk. Everything is documented. Every interaction is logged. Television, if allowed, is limited. Programs are restricted. Educational materials exist, but access depends on classification level. Many inmates lose eligibility for programs entirely once they enter these facilities. Phone calls are rare. Visits are even rarer. In some cases, inmates speak to family through thick glass, using phones monitored and recorded. In others, visits are conducted remotely or not at all. Letters become the main connection to the outside world. But even mail is inspected, delayed, and sometimes rejected. Over time, the lack of stimulation and social contact takes a toll. Former inmates describe heightened anxiety, memory problems, and difficulty concentrating. Some struggle with basic conversation after long periods of isolation. Officials maintain that these conditions are necessary to maintain safety for staff, for other inmates, and for the institution as a whole. But critics argue that this level of control reshapes behavior rather than correcting it. When every decision is removed, when every movement is dictated, and when silence becomes the default state, inmates are not learning how to function in society. They are learning how to survive confinement. And for many, survival becomes the only goal. In the next chapter, we'll examine how long inmates stay in this system, why releases are so rare, and how temporary placement often turns into something far more permanent. When inmates are first placed into America's most restrictive prison units, they are often told the same thing. This is temporary. Officials describe the placement as a response to behavior, a cooling-off period, or a necessary step to restore order. On paper, there are review processes, classification hearings, and pathways back to less restrictive housing. But in practice, leaving this system is far harder than entering it. Most inmates are reviewed every few months, sometimes every year. These reviews are conducted by classification committees made up of prison officials who rely on reports, disciplinary records, and psychological evaluations. The inmate is usually present, but their role is limited. They can speak. They can submit statements. But the decision has often been shaped long before the meeting begins. One infraction, even a minor one, can reset progress. A verbal argument. A refusal to follow an order quickly enough. Possession of contraband as small as excess paper. Each incident becomes evidence that the inmate is not ready. And because these facilities operate on control, perfect behavior is expected, not improvement. For inmates with mental health issues, the situation becomes even more complicated. Isolation can worsen symptoms, which in turn affects behavior, which then justifies continued isolation. It's a loop that is difficult to break without external intervention. Some inmates remain in these conditions for years, others for decades. In federal facilities, certain inmates are held until the end of their sentence, especially those serving life without parole. For them, the classification is effectively permanent. There is no incentive structure that leads to release, because release does not exist. Transfers out are rare and often tied to factors inmates cannot control: policy changes, court orders, or institutional restructuring. Legal challenges do exist. Civil rights lawsuits have forced some reforms, particularly around extreme isolation and mental health care. But litigation moves slowly, and relief is often limited to specific cases or jurisdictions. Meanwhile, the psychological impact accumulates. Inmates describe losing track of time, losing motivation, losing the ability to imagine a future beyond the cell. Some adapt by creating strict routines, exercise, reading, pacing. Others withdraw entirely. A few become defiant, which only reinforces the system's belief that they cannot be safely managed elsewhere. From the institution's perspective, these prisons work. Violence is reduced. Control is maintained. Predictability is achieved. But critics argue that this comes at a cost that is rarely measured: the permanent removal of individuals from any meaningful chance at change. Once an inmate is labeled as someone who belongs here, that label follows them. Across transfers, across reviews, across years, temporary placement becomes long-term confinement. Long-term confinement becomes a life defined by walls, routines, and silence. And for many inmates, the most damaging part is not the physical conditions. It's the knowledge that nothing they do may ever be enough to leave. In the next chapter, we'll examine the human cost of this system, how prolonged isolation affects the mind, the body, and the ability to function, both inside prison and beyond it. Long-term confinement in highly controlled prisons doesn't just change how inmates live. It changes who they become. Humans are social by nature. Conversation, routine interaction, and shared space help regulate emotion, memory, and behavior. When those things are removed for months or years at a time, the effects are not subtle, they are profound. Former inmates from restrictive housing units describe similar experiences, even across different states and federal systems. Sleep becomes irregular. Thoughts loop endlessly. Small sounds feel overwhelming. Some inmates begin talking to themselves, not out of habit, but necessity. Others lose the ability to focus long enough to read or follow a television program. Simple decisions become exhausting because decision-making has been removed from daily life. Mental health professionals have documented increased rates of anxiety, depression, panic disorders, and emotional numbness among inmates held in prolonged isolation. For individuals with pre-existing mental illness, symptoms often intensify. Yet treatment options inside these facilities are limited. Counseling sessions, when available, are brief and highly structured. Medications are prescribed, but monitoring is difficult when contact is minimal. In some cases, inmates are punished for behaviors that are symptoms of the very conditions isolation creates. The system becomes self-reinforcing. Isolation causes distress. Distress leads to behavior. Behavior justifies continued isolation. Physically, the effects also accumulate. Limited movement leads to muscle loss and joint problems. Poor sleep affects cardiovascular health. Stress weakens the immune system. But perhaps the most lasting damage is social. Inmates who spend years without normal interaction often struggle to interpret tone, facial expressions, and basic social cues. Some report feeling overwhelmed when placed near others again. Loud environments cause panic. Crowds feel threatening. Even correctional officers notice the change. Inmates released directly from restrictive housing into general population, or worse, directly into society, often struggle to function. The skills needed to survive isolation do not translate to the outside world. This has led to growing criticism from legal scholars, psychologists, and human rights organizations. They argue that while safety is necessary, permanent extreme control creates long-term harm that extends beyond prison walls. Supporters of the system respond with a different argument. They say these facilities exist because certain individuals pose risks that cannot be managed elsewhere. That staff safety and institutional order must come first. That without these prisons, violence would rise. Both perspectives exist side by side. But what remains undeniable is this. Once someone is placed into this system, the cost is not only paid by the inmate, but by society as a whole. Because prisons do not operate in isolation. They reflect values. They shape outcomes. And they leave marks that don't disappear when a sentence ends. In the final chapter, we'll examine why this system continues to expand, what reforms have been attempted, and whether America is moving toward more control or finally beginning to question who gets forgotten and why. Despite decades of criticism, legal challenges, and public debate, America's most restrictive prison systems remain firmly in place. In some areas, they are expanding. The reason is not simple, and it isn't driven by one institution alone. At its core, this system exists because it solves a problem prisons struggle with every day: control. Correctional facilities are overcrowded. Staff shortages are common. Violence, gang influence, and contraband threaten order in ways the public rarely sees. For administrators, restrictive housing offers a way to contain the most disruptive elements quickly and decisively. From an operational standpoint, it works. Incidents decrease. Movement becomes predictable. Risk is isolated. This makes these facilities attractive not just as a last resort, but as a management tool. Over time, what was designed for the most extreme cases becomes normalized. Policies broaden. Criteria expand. More inmates qualify for placement, not because they are worse, but because the system relies on the solution. Reform efforts have made progress, but slowly. Some states have reduced the length of time inmates can spend in extreme isolation. Others have introduced step-down programs designed to gradually reintroduce social interaction. Federal courts have placed limits on isolation for inmates with serious mental illness. But implementation varies widely. Programs depend on funding, on leadership, on political pressure. And when public attention fades, so does urgency. There is also a powerful cultural factor at work. Fear drives policy. When high-profile crimes occur, calls for tougher prisons grow louder. When incidents happen inside facilities, restrictive measures expand quietly, without debate. These decisions rarely make headlines, but they shape thousands of lives. At the same time, public awareness is changing. Former inmates, journalists, and advocacy groups are shedding light on conditions once hidden. Data is becoming harder to ignore, and courts are increasingly willing to question whether permanent isolation aligns with constitutional standards. The future of this system sits at a crossroads. One path leads to more control, more isolation, and more people placed beyond view. The other asks harder questions about safety, accountability, and the purpose of incarceration itself. Are these prisons truly about protection? Or have they become a place where the system sends people it doesn't know how to deal with? That question remains unanswered. What is clear is this: as long as these facilities exist, there will be inmates living lives defined by silence, out of sight, out of mind, and largely forgotten. There is an invisible line running through America's prison system. On one side is safety, protecting staff, inmates, and the public from real and immediate harm. On the other side is something harder to measure: erasure. Most people never cross this line. Most inmates never see it. But once someone does, the system treats them differently forever. In these prisons, punishment is no longer about time. It's about status. An inmate's sentence might say 20 years, 40 years, or life. But inside restrictive housing, the sentence becomes something else entirely. It becomes indefinite. Progress is difficult to prove. Redemption is difficult to measure. And mistakes, no matter how small, carry enormous weight. What makes this system especially powerful is how quietly it operates. There are no juries deciding placement, no public hearings, no headlines announcing long-term isolation. Decisions are made in offices, written into reports, and enforced behind locked doors. For the public, this creates distance. The people inside these facilities become abstract, labels instead of individuals. High risk, security threat, management problem. These words make it easier to accept extreme conditions without seeing the human cost. And yet, every person inside this system was once part of the outside world. They had families. They had identities beyond their inmate number. They existed in a society that ultimately decided how much control was enough. The debate over restrictive prisons is not just about inmates. It's about what kind of justice system exists when no one is watching. How much power should institutions have to isolate indefinitely? How much harm is acceptable in the name of order? And at what point does control become something else entirely? There are no easy answers. But what history shows is this: systems that operate in silence rarely correct themselves. Change only happens when light is forced in, through scrutiny, accountability, and public awareness. Because the moment a society accepts that some people can be forgotten completely, it reshapes the meaning of justice for everyone. For a small number of inmates, the doors do eventually open, not into freedom, but into something unfamiliar and overwhelming. When someone leaves one of America's most restrictive prison units, the transition is rarely gradual. In many cases, inmates are moved directly from long-term isolation into a less restrictive environment with little preparation. After years of silence and rigid routine, the change can feel destabilizing. Noise becomes unbearable. Crowds feel threatening. Simple interactions trigger anxiety. Things most people take for granted, standing in line, sharing space, making eye contact, can feel impossible. The skills required to survive isolation do not translate into social environments. Correctional staff have acknowledged this problem quietly for years. Inmates released from extreme control units often struggle more in general population than those who never experienced isolation. Some accumulate disciplinary infractions not because they are violent, but because they cannot adapt fast enough. This often sends them back, in and out of restrictive housing, a revolving door of control. For inmates released directly into society, the challenge is even greater. Employment, relationships, decision-making, emotional regulation. All of it requires skills that prolonged isolation weakens. Without strong support systems, many former inmates find themselves overwhelmed by freedom itself. This raises a difficult question for the justice system. If prisons are meant to prepare people for life after incarceration, what purpose does a system serve that removes the ability to function socially? Supporters argue that public safety must come first, and that some individuals may never be suited for reintegration. Critics counter that permanent damage increases risk rather than reducing it. Studies have shown higher rates of recidivism among individuals released from long-term isolation compared to those released from general population. The very system designed to control risk may be creating it. Inside prisons, administrators are beginning to recognize this reality. Some facilities now experiment with step-down units, gradual reintroduction programs, and increased human contact. These efforts aim to balance safety with rehabilitation, but they remain limited and inconsistent. For many inmates, these changes come too late, or not at all. Once someone has spent years being managed rather than rehabilitated, the damage is difficult to undo. The door may open, the chains may come off, but the effects remain. And this brings the story full circle. America's most restrictive prisons are not just places people are sent. They are systems that leave lasting marks on everyone they touch. Inmates, staff, families, communities. The question is no longer whether these prisons work. The question is what they leave behind. Long after the cell doors close, the impact of America's most restrictive prisons continues to spread, quietly, steadily, and often unnoticed. These facilities were built to solve immediate problems: violence, disruption, control. But over time, they have created a legacy that extends far beyond prison walls. Inside the system, correctional officers carry the weight as well. Working in environments built around isolation and constant vigilance takes a toll. Officers assigned to restrictive units report higher levels of stress, burnout, and emotional detachment. The same routines that enforce control over inmates also shape staff behavior, limiting interaction, discouraging empathy, and normalizing distance. This is not accidental. It is institutional. When a system is designed to minimize human connection, everyone inside it is affected. Families of inmates feel the impact next. Limited visits, restricted communication, years without physical contact. Parents age without seeing their children. Children grow up knowing a voice through a phone instead of a face. Relationships fracture under the strain of separation that feels permanent, even when it technically isn't. For communities, the effects are delayed, but real. Most inmates will eventually return to society. When they do, they carry experiences shaped by extreme control, silence, and isolation. Reintegration becomes harder. Support systems are strained. Cycles of incarceration continue. And for the public, the system remains largely invisible. These prisons are rarely discussed openly. They exist far from cities, behind layers of bureaucracy and security. Because they are hidden, they are easy to ignore. But silence is not neutrality. Silence allows policies to expand without scrutiny. Silence allows extreme measures to become routine. Silence allows people to disappear without being forgotten on paper, but forgotten in practice. History shows that systems operating without visibility rarely stay limited. What begins as an exception becomes a tool. What begins as control becomes habit. The legacy of these prisons will not be measured only by statistics or policies, but by the choices made about transparency, accountability, and restraint. Because the question is no longer just who is sent to be forgotten. It is what kind of justice system is built when forgetting becomes acceptable. Every system built on control eventually faces the same question. Who holds it accountable? America's most restrictive prisons operate within layers of authority, department policies, internal reviews, and legal standards. On paper, oversight exists. Inspections are scheduled. Reports are filed. Committees meet. But real transparency is rare. Many of these facilities limit media access. Independent observers face restrictions. Data on long-term isolation, mental health outcomes, and step-down success rates is often incomplete or difficult to obtain. What the public sees is usually the version filtered through official statements. Inside the system, accountability tends to move inward rather than outward. Complaints are handled internally. Disciplinary actions are reviewed by the same institutions that enforce them. Appeals are slow, technical, and dependent on resources most inmates don't have. This creates a gap between what is documented and what is experienced. Correctional officers are expected to follow strict procedures, yet they operate in environments where discretion matters. A tone of voice, the timing of a response, the interpretation of a rule. Small decisions can have long-term consequences for an inmate's classification. For inmates, challenging those decisions is risky. Filing grievances can label someone as difficult. Legal action can take years. And while retaliation is officially prohibited, fear of consequences keeps many silent. External oversight bodies exist in some states, but their power varies widely. Some can make recommendations. Few can enforce change. Budget constraints, political pressure, and public indifference often limit their reach. Courts remain one of the strongest checks, but only when cases reach them. Landmark rulings have forced reforms around extreme isolation, particularly for inmates with serious mental illness. Yet court decisions are narrow by design. They correct specific violations without dismantling the broader structure. So the system adapts. Policies are rewritten. Language changes. Conditions are reclassified rather than removed. What remains is a model that continues to function, legally, administratively, and quietly. This raises a deeper issue. When a system is hidden enough to avoid sustained scrutiny, it becomes self-justifying. Success is measured by order, not outcomes. Stability becomes proof of necessity. And harm becomes harder to quantify than control. Public awareness is the variable that changes this equation. When journalists investigate, when former inmates speak, when data is forced into the open, oversight becomes real. Not perfect, but visible. And visibility alters behavior. Because systems built in silence depend on that silence to survive. As long as these prisons remain out of sight, accountability remains limited. But when attention turns toward them, when questions are asked consistently and publicly, the balance begins to shift. And that is where responsibility ultimately lies. Not only with institutions, not only with policymakers, but with a society that decides how much it wants to know about what is done in its name. When all the policies, procedures, and arguments are stripped away, one truth remains clear. America's most restrictive prisons were not built by accident. They are the result of decades of fear-driven decisions, political pressure, and institutional convenience. Each layer of control was added in response to a crisis. Each expansion was justified as temporary. Each safeguard was framed as necessary. Over time, those temporary measures became permanent structures. What began as a solution for the worst of the worst evolved into a system that quietly absorbs anyone deemed too difficult, too disruptive, or too inconvenient to manage elsewhere. The criteria widened. The placements lengthened. the exits narrowed, and the public largely stopped looking. These prisons exist in a space where legality does not always equal justice, and where safety is often measured without accounting for long-term harm. They function efficiently, predictably, and with minimal visibility, qualities institutions value deeply. But efficiency is not morality. Control is not rehabilitation, and silence is not proof that a system is working. Behind every steel door is a human being shaped by isolation, routine, and removal from society. Some committed violent crimes. Others made repeated mistakes. Some were labeled risks based on prediction rather than action. Yet all were placed into environments where being forgotten became part of the sentence. The question this system leaves behind is not whether prisons should be secure. They must be. The question is how much damage a society is willing to accept in the name of control, and how many lives can be reduced to classifications before justice loses its meaning. Because systems that erase people do not stay contained forever. They affect families. They affect communities. They affect the values that shape laws and policies. And most importantly, they define what happens when power operates without sustained oversight. America's most restrictive prisons may be hidden, but their consequences are not. They are written into records, etched into lives, and carried forward long after the doors close. And until those realities are fully confronted, the system will continue doing what it was designed to do best: remove people quietly, and let the world forget they were ever there. America's most restrictive prisons rarely appear in headlines. They don't invite public tours. They don't offer clear answers. But they exist, quietly shaping lives, policies, and the future of incarceration. What you've seen in this documentary isn't about one prison, one state, or one group of inmates. It's about a system, how it decides who is controllable, who is disposable, and who can be removed from sight without resistance. These facilities were built in the name of safety. They operate in the name of order. But they raise questions that go far beyond prison walls. What happens when punishment becomes permanent? When isolation replaces rehabilitation? And when silence allows entire populations to disappear from public concern? The answers to those questions matter, because systems like this don't stay hidden forever. They influence laws, shape justice, and define how a society treats its most powerless people. Whether these prisons represent necessary control or a failure of accountability depends on something simple: who is paying attention? Because when no one is watching, power expands quietly. If this documentary helped you understand what really happens inside America's most forgotten prisons, consider sharing it so others can see what's usually kept out of view. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.